Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in the new year for the second session of the Color of Law. Today, our topic is going to be discussing redlining and today's disparities. I think all of us can certainly, we all recognize we're living in historic times for better and for worse. Probably the greatest lesson of 2020 and even the first 7 days of 2021 is that all the different challenges that we're facing are certainly interdependent and interconnected, that we are indeed living a legacy of decisions made, living very much in the subjective future of intentional decisions made that are having long-term effects on society as we know it. As we spend some time today and over the next several weeks in these various discussions, talking about the long-term impact of redlining and the impact it's had on Black communities and brown communities all across this great nation. It's wonderful that we made the decision here in Columbia to not just admire the problem, but really to sit down together and talk about short-term and long-term solutions to addressing these created inequities and ways in which we can work together across intersectoral and intergovernmental relationships, great public, private, and philanthropic partnerships evidenced here today. So I want to thank each and every one of you on behalf of the people of the City of Columbia. And these types of collaborations don't just happen. And I really want to thank my friend and our councilwoman, Tameika Devine, for the passionate leadership that she's put into helping, making sure everyone has had the opportunity to share in this discussion. I want to thank all the panelists, our wonderful friends at Historic Columbia as well, for the role that you're going to play. You're going to have a treat, and I know that Ms. Devine's going to tap into the panelists, but you got some pros on here. You got some really talented people who walk the walk and not only and also talk the talk and know how to bring people together. So thank you for joining us for the Color of Law. I'm going to pass the law to my friend who's again exhibited amazing leadership in pulling this together, Councilwoman Tameika Devine.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor, and good evening, everybody. And thank you for joining us for the second session of the Color of Law. It is my honor to talk to you guys about the purpose. And the mayor is eloquently laid out the problem, but I will tell you that as your city leaders, we understand the importance of we as a community coming together to discuss these problems and come up with real solutions. I think in this day and age, especially through COVID-19, through the racial unrest and reckoning from last year, and the ongoing debate that we have on all levels of government, it's important that we understand how our past shapes our present and how what we do presently can certainly collectively shape our future. And so the purpose of tonight is to have this discussion, exploring the concepts that are outlined in the book, The Color of Law. And then at the end of this fourth series session, come up with real solutions that we can apply here in Columbia. This is not a problem that's unique to Columbia, but it's certainly a problem that Columbia is willing to tackle head on. And so it is my privilege to talk to you guys or to introduce our great moderator for the evening, who will then introduce our panel. She probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Most people know the amazing Cynthia Pryor-Hardy. Cynthia is a renowned communications executive and owner of On Point Media, LLC, which is a South Carolina-based public relations broadcasting media company. She has a weekly Sunday evening show, On Point with Cynthia Hardy, that is #1 in the state, and her popular television show, Watch Fox 57, gets high marks for objectively tackling tough topics such as this one and asking hard questions. Her weekly radio and TV broadcasts connect with audiences throughout South Carolina, parts of Georgia, and North Carolina. She also serves as news director for 2 Alpha Media stations, Hot 103.9 and the Big DM. And in that role, Cynthia delivers morning drive newscasts during national syndicated shows, The Breakfast Club and the Steve Harvey Morning Show. She's also a seasoned journalist with the unique ability to bring people together. And her work in this community is no stranger to any of us. She's worked for years hard in the community, not just connecting us, but informing us. And as she says every week, making sure that we're informed, because when we're informed, we're on point. And so it's my honor to introduce you guys to Cynthia Parra-Hardy, our moderator for this evening.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I am excited about being here, and especially because it's of the topic that we are discussing today. You know, a lot of times we look around and we see things that are occurring in our community and in our society in general that may be discriminatory, and we wonder how they came to be. Oftentimes we just kind of think that's just how things are. The discussions that you're having, of which this is the second of 4, as you mentioned before, helps us to answer the question, how did things get to be this way? And the hope, I know, Councilwoman, and you too, Mr. Mayor, the hope is that if we can explore and understand greater how these things came to be, then perhaps that gives us a better opportunity to kind of figure out some strategies for dealing with those inequities. Our panel tonight is diverse and talented, covering areas of education, healthcare, the wealth gap, social justice, children's issues, and affordable housing. Our last session, moderated by Warren Bolton, was fascinating, and the book is a good read. So to help us understand some of these inequities and how we might come about those strategies that Councilwoman Devine talked about a moment ago, then I'd like to introduce our panel to you, and then we'll get right on in with the questions and get this show on the road. I'm delighted to introduce my friend, Dr. Ronald Epps from Kansas City, Kansas. Now, Dr. Epps has served as superintendent at Rockford Public Schools, and also we all remember when he served as superintendent of Richland School District 1, which is the largest Midland school district. After that, he did a stint. Of course, he accepted a position with Stupsky Foundation. It's a San Francisco-based foundation dealing with educational reform. And since he's retired, he's a consultant now and consulting in areas of leadership, organizational development, and structure, educational structure. Dr. Cheryl Scott is a public health physician from Oakland, California. She spent 20 years as a commissioned officer in medical epidemiology. She focuses on maternal health, and also during the time that she spent those 20 years, she also, as a commissioned officer and medical epidemiologist, she also did a lot of work in HIV/AIDS prevention, treatment, and care infrastructures of those things. That's probably why she's such a great asset over at the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, where she recently joined as a consultant in areas of community health, women's health, and HIV/AIDS. Dominic Miarden, president and CEO of Optus Bank. It's an FDIC designated minority depository institution. Spent a lot of time, more than a decade, as a senior executive officer at a community development bank, Southern Bancorp, and under his leadership now that he's here with us, Optus Bank has reached over 185 million in assets. That's up from the low of 47 million when he got here, while directing nearly 90% of the loans. And this is interesting, and you'll want to know, 90% of the loans that they let go to underserved communities, businesses, and people. And so we are delighted that Dominic Miarden is with us today too. Councilwoman Ann Sinclair, second woman elected to Columbia City Council. She served there for 20 years. During that time, she was particularly interested in land use and parks and beautification, neighborhood revitalization, the arts, public art especially. In 1989, she switched gears. Since then, she has provided her services in organizational development. I've sat in on a number of her classes: organizational development, strategic planning, executive coaching, resource development for nonprofits and small businesses. Now Ann, well, the name of the company is Ann Sinclair Consulting. Currently, she also, I'm a little nervous because I'm introducing somebody who's kind of my boss. She currently serves as vice chair of Columbia Housing. In addition to my media work on air, I'm also in the communications department over at Columbia Housing and loving it. And Ann Sinclair is a commissioner there. Dr. Aditi Shrivastava Bussells is the director of research over at Children's Children's Trust, South Carolina. She leads mixed methods research efforts on adverse childhood experiences. It's also called ACE for short. She also focuses in on race equity, community mobilization, public opinion, all to improve family and community resilience. In her role, she also oversees Kids Count, and we're all familiar with the great research tool that has been in our community. So we are delighted to welcome all of you all as panelists tonight, and I'll get right on in with the questions. Dr. Scott, citizens who lived in neighborhoods that were once subjected to discriminatory practices and lending are today more likely to experience shorter lifespans, persistent health disparities. And as we focus on the history of segregation and discrimination that's documented in the color of the law, how do we fix and address these compounded problems? And I also want you to also address the significance of the fact that we are tying them all together.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. And I'm really glad to be part of this wonderful panel. This is an area, residential segregation and discrimination are something that is very close to my heart and has been close to my work for most of my career. So thank you. I really enjoyed the color of law and the detail that was in describing the role of the federal government at the various historic points where we were introducing, establishing, reestablishing, and enforcing residential segregation, even when the community had evolved and was already integrated. I appreciated particularly how the structural racism and discriminatory policies led and drove residential housing and health inequality in America. So there's quite a connection to driving a sense of racial entitlement and an unrealistic belief in white superiority in our nation. Those are only two of the several consequences of segregation. So yes.
And I was going to ask you about some of the chronic conditions that we see in underserved communities and how that ties to where we live. Sometimes it's hard for us to make the connection that where we live determines our access to certain things like quality education, like quality healthcare, like good infrastructure, even investment in the communities where we live.
Sure, but underlying those chronic conditions are the social determinants of health that characterize those neighborhoods. A person's immediate surroundings, access to primary care, adequate education, healthy food, clean water, jobs, transportation, safe housing, environment free of toxins. Those are the root causes of the persistent health disparities. The health disparities have been there a long time, and it's only recently that there's a recognition that these root causes are really what are driving the mortality and the history of residential segregation as well. So in terms of the health disparities, there are so many that we hear about so much. We know and we live with them and we integrate them. So Black adults, for example, have the highest rates of heart disease, twice the likelihood of dying from heart disease than the least affected racial group. And that was in 1999. 10 years later, in 2017, it's the same thing. In the US, Black newborns die at 3 times the rate of white newborns. And recent findings also suggest that when Black newborns are cared for by Black physicians, the mortality is half that.
Wow.
Asthma occurs among African-American children at a rate twice that of white children, and Black mothers are at greater risk for adverse health outcomes and mortality during pregnancy. And recent research shows that this is due to cumulative effects of socioeconomic disadvantages and racism over the life course. So it's not like something you can intervene with during 9 or 10 months of the pregnancy. The rates of obesity, hypertension, diabetes, these are Yeah, there's so many of them.
There
And of course, COVID-19, African
Mhm.
Americans continue to be disproportionately infected and die from COVID-19 at rates more than 1.5 times their share in the population, and in some states even higher.
Sure. Dr. Epps, let's talk about education a little bit, and maybe I need to backtrack a little bit to make sure that everybody understands that redlining is the practice, was the practice of the government that limited places where African American people lived. And by doing that, it devalued the property in those areas where people lived. And in some of those redlined areas, you couldn't get a lot of money for things. For instance, if you were trying to sell your property, or if you wanted to rent it out, those areas were downplayed by bankers and all those kinds of things. What kind of effect did that have on the educational attainment of our children? Can you hear me, Dr. Epps?
Yes, I can now. Thank you, those who put this panel together and gave me an opportunity to serve on it. It's a very important, multifaceted discussion. It's interesting because I have lived the experience of redlining, and I've lived the impacts of that it's had on especially public pre-K-12 education.
I bet.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. And the interesting reality is that America's system of apartheid, whether you're in Columbia, South Carolina, or whether you're in Kansas City, Kansas, or Rockford, Illinois, wherever you are, has had lasting and devastating impacts on education and on young people in general. Ironically, it has had a negative impact on not only the students and young people who were most adversely affected, but it's had an adverse impact on all children.
Sure.
I took a group of superintendents from the Midlands, 4 superintendents from the superintendents, to the neighborhood that I grew up in Kansas City. And that neighborhood had been totally wiped out as a result of practices of redlining, urban renewal, highway development, whatever you want to call it. It wiped out a pretty self-sufficient middle to lower middle income African-American neighborhood. There are several issues that related to that. One of the things I'm often asked is who's responsible and who should be responsible for repairing those damages. Well, if this were a court of law, they would look at who was responsible for the damages, who was responsible for the outcome. And as we look at that, we realize it's government at all levels: federal, state, and local, law enforcement, judiciary, realtors and developers, media, individuals. The cast of characters for those responsible goes on and on and on. And so therefore the cast of characters for those responsible for remedying those outcomes are equally diverse. Government at all levels, law enforcement, judiciary, realtors, and so forth. Too often though, it falls on school districts and school systems to mitigate those outcomes. The good news is that while redlining was probably one of the most effective means of maintaining apartheid or segregation in this country, redlining played a tremendous, it was a tremendous tool for maintaining that institution. It wasn't always, redlining wasn't always in existence. In fact, it was probably, some would say, the housing boom of the post-war housing boom was largely responsible for its implementation and spreading throughout the country. But fortunately, there's some things that can be done to remedy the negative impacts of redlining. One is supplemental assistance. School districts are beginning to realize that you can't treat all children the same. You can't provide all students the same methodology, the same pedagogy in addressing issues when they come in very different situations. One of the most profoundly negative impacts on children, and we're finding more and more about this issue of adverse childhood experiences. Someone mentioned it earlier, ACEs. Those experiences that children have, not just minority children, but all children have at different points in their lives. But we know that children from poverty experience those adverse childhood experiences at significantly higher levels. There are things that can be done to mitigate those. One is another issue, in addition to supplemental assistance, is the issue of strategic accountability. This state and every state I've been in, every state I've worked with, has tried to implement rigorous systems of accountability. But in my estimation, we are really going about it wrong, because we're using accountability as a means of punishing and rewarding. And so we use high stakes testing to punish and reward. And it causes all kinds of unintended consequences. Altering data, not getting the real data. In order to have strategic accountability, you've got to have accurate data that really tells you how you're performing as a system and how your children are performing as individuals, so that you can make the necessary adjustments at the various points of their education. So high stakes testing that rewards and punishes is the exact opposite thing you should be doing. High stake, the testing, both in this state and in other states, should be used to help the system understand what's working and what's not working, to help the teachers in the classroom understand what needs to be done differently, and where you need more interventions and where you need less interventions. So strategic accountability is another issue that in those schools and those school districts where we have tried to implement transformative initiatives, one of the first things we tackled was the issue of strategic accountability, dismantling the high stakes testing to reward and punish, and in its place use high stakes testing to inform the system as to what its strategy should be. And then the fourth solution is to retraining our teachers and our leaders. I was not trained to be a teacher in the 21st century schools. I was not trained to be a leader in 21st schools. I was trained to be a leader in the schools that I had attended. And the needs of our children today are not the same as the needs of the children when I was in school.
Sure.
There was a place for everybody when I was in school. There was the assembly line, everybody had a place. And if you couldn't find a place, you went into the military. And the military the military doesn't want you now if you don't come with certain skills and certain aptitudes. So we've got to train our leaders, we've got to train our teachers to understand the issue of the metacognitive sciences, to understand that intellect and intelligence is elastic, it's not static. To understand that there's certain principles of education that can expand the ability of all of our students. We've got to start using gifted education as a social reward and special education as the opposite. I could go on and on and on, but these are some of what I see as solutions to this issue. that we can't go back and eliminate the impacts. We can't eliminate the fact that redlining was a part of our history. But
Sure.
what we must do is mitigate the effects, the impacts that it has had and that it is still having. There are elements of redlining that still exist in Columbia, South Carolina, throughout the state and
They're
throughout this.
evident.
We
They're
must
evident.
eliminate them, and we must mitigate root and branch the vestiges of those past practices.
That's a great segue to Dominic Miartin. Dominic, one of the things that Optus Bank tries to do is remedy some of those things that Dr. Epps spoke about a moment ago. And especially by recognizing that the income and wealth gaps among communities of color are great when compared to majority populations. And so talk to us a little bit about that. There are all kinds of studies that talk about when the money isn't present, what we can and what we cannot do. And particularly one of the things that I've been very interested in is a number of small businesses that I've seen you support. Can you talk to us about the significance of that in the context of combating the vestiges of redlining?
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, we can.
Thank you for the sound check as well. Let me first start by thanking Councilwoman Devine for one, reaching out and pulling us together, because I think this is a critically important conversation, as the mayor said as well. And I also want to thank her for even depressing me further by sharing the book that really gave me a sense of despair, to be honest with you, about the efforts that we have at Optus Bank and many other banks as almost futile. But I do feel very optimistic that we can make a difference. And the question that I get asked, how do you reverse 400 years of systemic, carefully constructed disadvantages for African Americans with a bank? And it's a valid question. And my response to it is, there is a tool that we all have. Each of us has a tool to reverse some of those disparities. You just heard very eloquent and thoughtful presentation from Dr. Epps, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists. We each have our own tools, and what I've been blessed with is to be a steward of this asset that was built over 100 years ago by very courageous African Americans, because they understood that without a vibrant banking system, they could not reach their full potential and realize the American dream that their white counterparts had been living for centuries. And so our bank, it was founded as Victory Savings over 100 years ago, is fulfilling that obligation, but we need to scale. And so to answer your question, the banking system is still suffering in a very grotesque way from those systemic disparities. A recent study just last year released by a secret shopper program by one of the Washington, D.C. based groups showed the same borrowers going to the same place, one with an ethnic name and one with a white name, with the same exact package, had hugely statistically significant different response rates.
Hugely.
And you can guess which group of borrowers got the worst end of that deal. And that was in 2019. Okay, so we know that the vestiges of this carefully constructed systemic racism that we have do impact the banking system. And now all money is green. I hear that too. And so anyone with the 5 C's of lending showing up at any bank is likely to get served, but there's still a huge disparity in access to credit, as I pointed out. So we believe at Optus Bank is state's only African-American owned bank, and one of soon to be 16 across the country left from the high of about 130. What can we do without 200 million in assets? What can we do? Well, we do matter to those 2,000 or 3,000 customers that we serve, right? And
Yes.
some of them are on this call and some of them come to me and say, you all put me in business 20 years ago, and now I have a business. Now my net worth is $500,000 or $1 million or more. was not before. So I think the key message that I'd like to deliver is we all can do something with the tools that we've been blessed with. But I do believe a bank cannot reverse 400 years of systemic disparities that impact millions and millions of people across America. But if the movement that we're now seeing to recognize that access to credit, access to opportunities, access to finance, everything from the Opportunity Zone legislation to the most recent bill that just passed that reauthorized the PPP program, also set aside $9 billion in capital from the US Treasury for minority lending institutions. The policymakers across the aisle are realizing that we need banks that are responsive and accountable to their communities. And we do have them, but what they need is more capital. And over multiple generations, we believe we can actually make a huge difference. So I look forward to learning from the rest of the panel how we do this in concert, because not a single one of us on this esteemed panel can change the trajectory by ourselves. But I think if we address health, economic, educational, environmental disparities, housing, all together in concert, I think we could make a difference.
So, Dom, you can't just give money away, right? So what are some of the things that you're able to do to try to get, let's say we're talking about businesses, to get businesses ready to borrow? You know what I mean?
Great question. And I have to tell folks all the time, some people have seen that we've raised over $150 million in the last few years, and they think it's grant money. I have to tell them we're a highly regulated bank.
Highly regulated, Dom,
highly regulated, over-regulated, if the right people are listening. But, we're not a grant-making organization. We're a finance organization. And so you're right. But especially now, we encourage all of our customers and small businesses, the hundreds of small businesses we've been able to help this year, is to be very proactive in responding to the needs of the current economy. Take the actions necessary now to get yourself ready to prepare. There are great resources in our state and in our city. The City of Columbia, let me give them a shout out. We do a lot of work in partnership with the City of Columbia to close the gaps that traditional finance cannot close. So borrowers need to be aware there is help out there, but make sure you're ready. Make sure you work with the Business Development Center. Benedict College recently opened a Business Development Center in partnership with SBA. There are resources in our community that can help someone not just get ready to seek credit or seek opportunities or seek access to support, but they also need to be proactive in reaching out and getting ahead of it. Because as you know, today's economic environment is highly unpredictable. And we don't want to just wait around and see. We want to step out there and find ways to close those gaps and help folks access those opportunities.
Absolutely. Dr. Bustles, let me segue to you now as we talk about communities and investing in communities to make things thrive. In the tradition of a number of, there's an old African proverb. And when we greet people, oftentimes people in the African American use it, and it's how's the children? And when you say how's the children, it's everything, right? Because everything starts with the kids. So I'm asking you, how are the children?
So first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. I'm learning a lot from all of the incredible colleagues that I get to be on here with. My research is focused on that very question. How do the experiences that they have early in childhood affect everything that happens across the lifespan? And so we've had a couple of conversations already about that, right? First of all, health is not a static thing. It's fluid. It's from a culmination of experiences. And if there's something we've learned through the COVID pandemic, it's not just our individual choices that predispose us to the virus. It's a lot of socioeconomic factors, such as who are our essential workers? What neighborhood do we live in? Do we have access to healthcare? How affordable is the vaccine testing? To me, that's a very real world example of what we are talking about theoretically. In my research, I have found that Black children are much more likely to live in unsafe neighborhoods and be much more likely to be exposed to adverse childhood experiences, which include things like household chaos, having someone in the house that may have substance use issues, mental illness, all the way to not having enough food to eat, or not being able to make sure basic needs are met for themselves. And what we found in our studies is that this leads to coping with unhealthy substances. When you have that much stress and you don't have an adult or an environment that you can go to that makes you feel like you matter, ultimately what happens is you cope the best way you know how. And that's when we start to see some of those risk behaviors. That's also why we may see some of the highest rates of drug misuse in our minority communities, because there's a lot of trauma. And so one of the things I challenge people when they chat with me about some of my research is to really start shifting your thinking about how we deal with complex problems. The question isn't, what's wrong with you? You know, smoking is bad for you. The question is more so, what's happened? Why and how did we get here in the first place? And when we make that mental shift, we really start to think about solutions a little bit differently. We start to focus more on long-term sustainable solutions as opposed to a Band-Aid to the problem, which is often, I'm going to tell you the smoking is bad. You know it's bad for your child. Of course, we have that education around us all the time. And I'm using smoking as an example because it's one of the, it's pretty prevalent in the American South, right? But ultimately what that leads to is those disparities that Dr. Scott was talking about in terms of obesity, diabetes, heart disease. And so when we start to see children really being the point of opportunity for us to make change, I think anything is possible. And so what I've really been hearing from this conversation is that ultimately for us to address redlining, racial residential segregation, and the disparities that we are seeing, it comes down to three things. And to me, that is opportunity, investment, and equity. And in terms of opportunity, in our research, we've actually found that some of our neighboring cities are doing a really good job of making sure that there are opportunities specifically for Black families, Black business owners, and Black entrepreneurs. One example is Raleigh, which is considered the mecca of Black entrepreneurship because there are so many startups that are owned by Black people. That is something that we can easily adopt here because with that opportunity comes investment, comes other folks that want to come into that city and they say, I want to start something here. I want to put my roots here and I want to stay here for a long time. And what that does in turn for all of us that care about some of the social issues facing children and families is that there's investment in government resources, which allows us to then fund some of the things we'd like to fund for long periods of time, not these 3-year, 5-year, grants that go away. And ultimately, then it leads to equity. And when I talk about equity, I'm not saying that everybody should get the same thing. That's not equity. Equity means that you're giving people what they need. And that's recognizing the hundreds of years of disadvantage that our Black and Brown families have experienced throughout the country. And so that's really, again, shifting our narrative around making sure that communities get what they need instead of always trying to be equal, because that's also what's going to ultimately get us to the place that we want to be in the city of Columbia. Sure. That's ultimately going to lead us to hopefully never seeing ACEs happen, right? But in the meantime, there are a lot of protective things that we can do, like ensuring that the schools are a safe, stable, nurturing place for children so that despite experiencing adversity, they have people to go to that make them feel safe. They have an environment that tells them you matter, you belong. It means investing in parents and recognizing that parents are trying to do the best they can. And oftentimes when they have to go work that job while the rest of us get to work from home, there's a lot more that's going into why that child's late to school, right? Because there's a lot of compounded things that are happening. So really thinking about removing stigma in terms of community supports for parents. And I can go on and on, but those are some of the things that I think about in terms of how do we solve this problem, particularly by starting with the children.
Okay, Councilwoman Sinclair, you're up next. Most people know you now from your consulting work, all that high-powered boardroom stuff that you do, but I know you from walking neighborhoods and fixing basic problems. So talk to us a little bit about that whole zoning thing and redlining and where you stand on it and what you've seen the city of Columbia do over the years, and are we getting better?
Well, first, I do think the city is getting better about zoning, but I just want to make, for people who are on this call, and if you have not read this book, you really need to take the time to read the book. when I read it, I'm a believer that government can make a positive difference in people's lives, that, you know, government is people who are well-meaning. And I have to say, this book was like a kick in the gut.
I have to put it down, Anne. I have to put it down. When I see
Yes.
what the Federal Housing Administration did to people,
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it just, yeah, you know, but it helps with the enlightenment. But, you know, it's a hard read sometimes when you realize what our government has actually been behind, and when you realize that I see it indicated in the people that I know.
It was really one of the most difficult books I've ever read, because I believe so much in government. And I started getting involved in city government in the 1980s. And actually it was through zoning. It was from my narrow perspective of the neighborhood that I lived in, the commercial areas that surrounded me. And so I had to really roll up my sleeves and study it, because I am here to tell you, zoning is not a particularly exciting thing to get involved in, but I learned really fast what a difference it made. And then when I became a part of Columbia City Council, I continued my interest in zoning, but then I switched to looking at the city as a whole. And when you think of the history of zoning in our city, you know, the city started doing land use planning and zoning in the 1920s. Dr. Epps talked about the housing boom after World Wars I and II, and that's when a lot of things happened. But the decisions that were made in the city of Columbia were by and large by white men. And that's the lens that was used. And so zoning was set up to, on paper, protect the residential areas of the city. But in reality, the way it played out, it was to protect the white residential areas of the city. So you had areas where there were primarily Black neighborhoods that also had light industrial right close by. So there were different kinds of businesses that you would have not seen next to a white neighborhood. And, you know, when you talk about redlining, when you have an area that has, say, a Coca-Cola bottling plant or some kind of major laundry or whatever, it's right there, then it makes it easy to say, oh, you don't want to go there. But so I'm not sure if it's a chicken or the egg kind of thing, but zoning land use decisions make a huge difference. And all through our history, there has not been enough affordable housing. We talk about it now as an issue. It's always been an issue for the city. There's study after study that shows there's a lack of affordable housing. And where,
but you know what there isn't, and you know what there isn't? There isn't a lot of clarity around why people don't have decent places to live, and the fact that, you know, it's baked in the cake. You know what I mean?
And some of the things that we're talking about here, the lack of access to capital, the lack of being able to get a loan to buy a house.
All of that.
All those things play in together.
Because they look at that paper with this big red line around this area, and that's where you stay away from, because that's where those people live.
I do think things are better. The decision makers are much more representative of our community. But as has been said by the other panelists, no one can just wiggle their nose and have these things go away. These are, you use the term of baked in the cake. These are very entrenched situations that are not going to easily disappear. I believe it's going to have to take a whole community effort to make a difference. It's not all these different subjects that we're discussing today. You can't just take one and solve the problem. It's every issue together.
Yeah, but there's something empowering about having the information and understanding the problem, as difficult as the problem may be. You know, at least gives you a place from which to start. You know, and so, and this is empowering information even to people who are having a tough time, you know, to understand and acknowledge, you know, I wasn't just born to be in this situation. There are circumstances that created this for me. So how do I get from here to there? And that to me is a very empowering conversation, and why I was very excited about the color of law and the very candid and brazen way that Tameika decided to do this, because this is a heavy book. Information, it's that hard to talk about information that we're better for it when we know and when we talk about it with each other. You know what I'm saying? Now, Ann, can you tell me something? I understand. Now, this is a question that was given to me. Is the city undergoing a zoning review and setting the stage for what's called a unified development ordinance, something that consolidates and revises the current zoning and land development ordinances? What should we be expecting from that?
This is a process that the city has, made multiple efforts to try and revisit the zoning ordinance. I want to say it may be close to 50 years or so since there's been a major overhaul. Even when I was on city council, I knew that our zoning ordinance created challenges for doing things that we're seeing now in terms of mixed use, so that you had residential and, you know, small businesses, little cafes, things like that working together. Our old zoning ordinance makes things like that a challenge. The city and the city's planning staff have worked really hard to bring this forward. There's a public hearing that will occur, I believe, on the 19th. My understanding is that there won't be a vote taken. And so what I would urge people to do is to take advantage of opportunities to find out how this works. What is going to happen to their neighborhood, the commercial areas that are around their neighborhood. And again, this is not easy. The text is several hundred pages long, and it describes what residential use means and what commercial use means and what light industrial means. And it's complicated, but people really need to work to understand how it fits together. So this there's been a lot of meetings, but this public hearing really is, in many respects, an opportunity to open the door for people to learn about what is going to happen in their neighborhood, in the commercial areas near them. And if they have problems or have questions about it, this is the time to speak.
Well, that's good. That's at least some information that we can have and have some kind of contribution, because from that I expect policy to come about. When my husband and I lived in North Columbia for 15 years, he met so many times with elected officials about just wanting to get a Chick-fil-A down the street, you know, just wanting to have, I don't know, Publix. And those talks never went anywhere, and everybody always pointed to redlining as to why. Likewise, when we got ready to sell the house and get the house appraised, we had to, you know, go back to the drawing board a few times, because the same house in Shannon, same floor plan,
Yes.
$50,000 difference, $50,000 difference. And so, you know, those were, you know, sometimes those harsh realities hit you when you live them. You know, reading them in a book doesn't just do justice to it. But it's just an interesting thing. And I think we all need to recognize what we're up against so that we can fortify ourselves, so that we can look and do better, in terms of whatever we can do to combat those vestiges that are still there, that we didn't do anything to create, but impact us nonetheless. So.
And when you think about where in our community, where Black neighborhoods are, they're in areas where there may be creeks running through them that flood.
Train tracks.
Train tracks, industrial, small airports. It's all these different things that are part of having a city, but the way they're situated, it's like one part of our community bears the brunt. And that's where land use is really important.
Sure.
Really important.
I want to throw this question out, and I want to say I want Dr. Epps and Dr. Bustles, but any of you all that want to take a stab at this, this is another one of those questions that was submitted, and I kind of want to talk about it. It's tied into what Ann was talking about, but it has to do with government-sponsored segregations, which is what we get from redlining. But when we try to fix it, or when the government steps in to try to fix it, the questioner says, because when they do that, the social engineering of that often results in unintended consequences that we end up regretting. You know what I mean? It's kind of like when integration came and they said, okay, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to put you all together and I want you to like it. And then we began to self-segregate because we didn't like it so much. And so when social engineering happens, there are unintended consequences. Should the government step in to try to fix some of this? And if so, what does that look like? Dr. Epps, you want to take a stab at that before Dr. Bustles?
Yeah, I'll be willing to take a stab at it. The government played a major role in the negative reality. So it's incumbent on the government to step in and try to remediate the very things that they created. There are unintended consequences for all government action. It doesn't matter what level of government, it doesn't matter what the action is, there's always unintended consequence. However, the aggrieved party has a right to remedy, and it has a right to remedy from the institution, the organization, or the individual
that caused the issue.
Original tort.
Gotcha.
So the question as to social engineering, all social engineering is trying to, everything we do is social engineering because we're trying to make our society better. Okay. And I've heard the courts attack for social engineering. I've heard government attack for social engineering, and I've sure heard the school districts attack for social engineering. That is just a buzzword. The fact is, we all of these entities should be about making life better for all of us. Sure. And when it comes to once a tort simply means harm. Once a harm is established, and once it's identified who established the harm, and in this issue of redlining, and in this issue of segregation and oppression, it's clear the government's role. The government can't deny its role, so the government must have a responsibility for remedying the very thing it created.
Wow. Dr. Bustles.
So one of the things I do want to distinguish here and is that the federal government had played a major role, and we learned that in the Color of Law. That's not to dismiss all of the action and inaction on the state and local level. But the first thing I think about in terms of, is the government responsible? I say, yes, the federal government is responsible. And we learned that even in this book, in times where people wanted to integrate, the Federal Housing Authority came in and said, no, that's not good for you. Let's do something to literally cancel that, in Dr. Epps' words, social engineering of wanting to live together, right? And so that's where, yes, we need federal level policy or reversal of policies or intentional equitable policies that give more to those that things were unjustly taken away from for years. Mm-hmm. In terms of local and state, I think that looks a little bit different. We also learned through the COVID pandemic that when a city like the city of Columbia has done everything they can that's evidence-based in terms of getting that mask ordinance in, making sure that, we have safe social distancing, but then the state and the federal government doesn't have that same consistent response. We're not going to see change. So what I think on a city level that needs to be done is going back to making sure that we create an environment that is conducive to uplifting some of our most disadvantaged communities, whether that's through revisiting and developing a stronger relationship with our school districts to understand how we even create our districts, how we fund those schools. Is that formula working? Do we need to go to the state legislature to understand and figure out why that needs to improve? All the way to how are we bringing businesses in, or how are we incentivizing Black business owners to keep their businesses here, right? And Dom talked a little bit about how their bank is doing that, but that's only one bank out of, and they, that does not serve the whole state of South Carolina. So how do we incentivize and make sure that other banks are following suit about this and doing some of the similar things that they've been doing to make sure that our Black business owners are getting what they need? So that's what I'd focus on a city level. I don't think social engineering is bad. I think that it typically comes from a good place. I think any social policy has unintended consequences, and we just have to be ready in terms of making sure that as we realize it's not working, that we don't keep it on the books, that we do what we need to do to get others at the table to fill in those gaps that the government can't fill. Because the reality is that the government can't do everything either. It takes us as well. It takes us being civically engaged. It takes us doing good research and making data-driven decisions. And it takes us having strong collaborations with existing businesses that are willing to lift others up.
Sure, absolutely. It does take everybody standing in the gap for everybody else. I mean, because the problems are mammoth problems, they are, and they're many, but if we have a chance at fixing some of these things, working together, there's no better solution than that. It's coming up on 7 o'clock, so now it's time to go to audience questions so we can have a fresh new slate of questions for all of you guys. You okay up there, Dr. Scott? Can't hear you.
Yeah, I said I am. Yeah, I just wanted to add also that just like Dr. Epps and Bussell said, it's really critical that the federal government created this. They need to be involved in, first of all, acknowledging that they created it, because a lot of communities take on, internalize that it's something negative about them, that they can't get their communities up in advancement. So I think it's really important, first of all, that they acknowledge it and that they do something about fixing it, and that they work with the communities. And one of the public health methodologies that a lot of public health departments use is doing surveillance. We'll work with government and say, we also are going to do public health surveillance on these problems to make sure that inequitable practices don't re-emerge, because they do over time.
Certainly they do, absolutely. And, that's not talked about a lot, government's involvement in the way we are, the way things are. And that's why I call this effort just a very bold effort, to have these conversations so that it can at least lift the awareness of people in the marketplace. It's important that, these conversations are going on simultaneously in different hubs, and each of you, you reign over your hub, and so there are things that each of the panelists can do in their sphere, in your sphere, to get things done. And so this is really, really empowering for that reason. And also, I too want to commend Councilwoman Devine, because having good, solid experts like you guys on a panel, it takes it to a different level. It's not just chit chat. I mean, it's real great discussion. So, and I'm enjoying this, but I got to let the audience get some questions in, or I'd be delving into it and just leaning in for the next 30 minutes to an hour myself. So let me go ahead and let Jennifer go ahead and talk to me about questions, either she or Councilwoman Devine.
We do have a Q&A box, so if you have any questions for the panelists, you can submit them at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A button. You can click on that and enter your question. So one question we have from Cassandra Elliott that says, even though zoning issues may be better, why does it appear that the city of Columbia is systematically erasing the presence of African-American communities in its borders?
It's an interesting question. Do we want the panel to pick that up? Or do we want Councilwoman Devine to pick that up? Let's talk about that a little bit. I was on a panel, guys, and I was moderating a panel for city council candidates. And one of the questions was about gentrification and Howard Duvall was one of the candidates. And, you know, Howard was like, it's the darndest thing. You know, in order for there to be investment in a community, typically it comes when the city begins doing landscaping and things like that. When that happens, it interests everybody in wanting to invest in that community. That effort kind of makes the taxes go up a little higher. So either we want things to advance or we want things to stay the same. That was the kind of scenario that he played out, you know, at that moment for us to kind of think about that so that we could get a good feel for what we were asking for and what we weren't asking for. So I just kind of laid that out there a little bit too, just for that. So that question had to do with the fact that, okay, we know the city acknowledges it and all that other stuff and get working and everything, but what are we going to do to keep historic communities intact, particularly those African-American communities? Does anybody want to volunteer before I call on somebody? Well,
I'll jump in.
let's talk about what you used to. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I'm here. I'll jump in, Cynthia, and then
Yes.
and Ian may want to add anything or any other panelists. But I think, first of all, Cassandra, I thank you for that question because I think that that's those are one of the things that we have to have that conversation about, whether it's an intent or it's even not even realized by the city. Until something is realized, acknowledged, and then addressed head on, you can't address it. And so I do know that I hear from a lot of communities who feel like the city does not invest the same resources in African-American communities. And so then the communities may fall disrepair, and then some, you know, then people come in and buy up the property, and then but before you know it, it's gentrified. So unlike the intentional things that we talked about before, and Dr. Donaldson and Cynthia, you mentioned this about our conversations last month. Those were intentional. You know, Wheeler Hill, Arsenal Hill, the city gentrified those neighborhoods. You don't find intentional gentrification happening now, but I think you do find investments in some areas where there aren't investments in others. And so that is part of really why these conversations are so important, because I think as we are looking at zoning, as we're looking at investment, as Dr. Bustles talked about, as we're looking at prioritizing the resources that the city puts in one area versus another, acknowledging that you may have to do more investment to make something equitable in a community that has been traditionally underserved and disinvested in. So I say that to answer your question. I don't know if I have a clear-cut answer for you as to saying that the city is intentionally doing anything, but I do think that there is a conversation happening right now that's very timely for our community and our city to realize, what do we need to do to invest to make sure that we're investing equitable resources in communities of color so that we can preserve those historic neighborhoods so that we don't see them go away. So we, you know, don't no longer have a Ward 1 and a Wheeler Hill like we had. We want to keep Greenview and other neighborhoods. And so how do we invest in those areas? So part of the resources that we're doing are looking at making sure that we're having loans for people to buy properties, loans for people to fix up your properties if you're in those areas. And then going back to Cynthia, you talked about recruiting businesses to be in those commercial corridors. And you mentioned like Publix and Chick-fil-A. I remember, you know, somebody in my community wanted a Whole Foods. Well, when you look at the demographics of Whole Foods and what they look at, they're not going to build that store in this community for several reasons. So understanding what those reasons are and then what we can do to make this area attractive for those commercial investments, we need to do, which means that might mean putting more money in investment, not just sidewalks and grocery stores, but other things that make those communities make investment into those communities more attractive to commercial prospects.
And to just advance that and bring Ann into the conversation, Ann said a few minutes ago when she was talking about zoning and working with zoning issues back when she was on council, that Tameika, most of those policies, determinants were conducted by or assigned by white men. The fact that you're in your spot doing what you're doing is a significant improvement. It's more than that. I think it's significant that you're there because you see things from the perspective that a white male may not. And so your decisions would, not that white male would not be making good, sound, heartfelt decision for that white male, but having you in position to do things like you mentioned a moment ago, making sure that lending opportunities are there and that people know that they're there to invest in communities in case they want to do that. Ways that empower communities so that they can see a way out of a situation and not just feel like they're locked in. Because that message that Howard Duvall mentioned to me when I did that moderated for John Black and those guys over at the neighborhood associations was that we do want investment in our communities, but we do have to be prepared for when that investment comes, it looks good to other people too. And because it looks good to other people too, then you start to get those vestiges of what we consider gentrification. And so, it's a balance. We want things to advance, but we want them to stay the same. And sometimes those things are diametrically opposed. So, Ann, did you want to say anything about any of that?
Yeah, because there is no easy answer. One of the things that was brought home to me by a neighborhood that I represented that was willing to take this new city council person wet behind the ears to take her by the hand and show me what their life was like and what they needed. And I listened and tried very hard to respond to what they were asking for. I think sometimes we get into, particularly people who are white, that, we know what you need. You need these things.
We're familiar with that.
And so I went into this neighborhood with that perspective, and
Oh, bless your heart.
I'm so grateful that they sort of took me aside and say, no, girlfriend,
No, that's not what you do.
here's what we need. And that was eye-opening. But this particular neighborhood, which has become more solid, there's more amenities that have occurred over time. We're now seeing where people want to come in, buy a property at a lower cost and make major changes in the neighborhood. And that I don't know that you can really stop that. I think what really is important is giving the people who live there and who want to stay there the tools to be able to do that. The wherewithal, the money that they need, whatever it is they feel like they need. I don't think we can impose that.
Dr. Bustles, you were looking like you wanted to say something. You were certainly nodding emphatically, and so were you, Mr. Miarton. Do you guys have a comment?
I will yield first, and then I do have a few thoughts, but
Dr. Bustles, would you like to jump in?
I was just looking at one of the kind of follow-up questions to Councilwoman Sinclair around zoning. And as we're thinking about the meeting coming up on January 19th about what an ideal zoning would look like, I just wanted to share that one of the things that has become really big in the housing world is this idea of inclusionary zoning. And that's intentionally incentivizing developers to create affordable housing within their units as opposed to creating those as separate units. So that way that brings opportunities for families with lower income to be able to be a part of a neighborhood that may be more affluent than what they would be normally be able to afford. And then it also makes me just think about when she talked about how, or I think actually it was you, Cynthia, we want more, but then sometimes we don't, and it's a conflict. you know, when we even talk about new housing developments coming in, I think about an example of friends talking about a new housing development, affordable housing development coming into Irmo, and they were very upset that that was happening because it was going to lower our property values. Those kids are going to be in our schools, and our schools are going to get crappier. These are very real conversations that I hear people have that claim to be public health, you know, fanatics or social justice
people,
right? And that's the part that we have to also change as well. That when you actually want to do something that's sustainable and meaningful over time, it's hard. It may immediately feel like something's being, quote, taken away from you. But that's how equity works, is that we bring people what they need. And ultimately, every study will show you that everyone benefits in the long term. And so it's those types of situations that we need to start thinking about differently in terms of when we are going to bring in more housing. One thing I'll say is South Carolina is #1 in evictions in the country. And if you liked Color of Law, please read Evicted, because it really opens your eyes as to why that happens. It's a perfect storm of policies and practices that make that happen. But if we want to do some of these things, it also requires us to change the way that we are thinking about what's bad and what's good for us, and recognize that our definition of what's my community and your community has to change as well. And that, again, we have to work alongside developers to develop some very creative solutions to make sure that kids have the opportunity right away, that we aren't zoning in hopes to make sure that a school district just gets better over time, that we're immediately doing the things to integrate kids into settings that can benefit them immensely right away.
Sure. Mr. Yarden?
Someone else chimed in?
I was just going to say, can I read out that question that Dr. Bustles referenced, in case that so everybody knows what she was talking about? The question was, what kinds of zoning practices create more equitable communities, and how can we ensure we create a new code accordingly? So in case anyone wants to reference that as well.
Dom, you want to go ahead and continue?
Well, a couple of points. I can comment some on that, but from a pure just economic development perspective and financing perspective, you know, I think the city of Columbia has several really good programs that do help close the gap and provide incentives for folks to move into areas and rehab houses. I think that those are great programs. They do need to be expanded, but again, by themselves, it still doesn't close the gap, right? So if that neighborhood or the community is not appealing to that person, that financing is not going to be enough unless the financing is so highly incentivized that it provides almost a drive for that person or that business to locate there, which then goes back to the kind of the social engineering, right? What do we want to see? But I do see some successful communities that have been referenced, you know, are very intentional. Certain areas of town could receive a certain level of subsidy that then, in addition with the zoning rules, in addition to intentional redevelopment of local schools, community schools, the amenities, I think the city is doing a good job. But we also need to be mindful that I've heard a lot of comments about access to credit and access to capital, which is critical, but it's difficult to make those credits available, those loans available in communities where where the values are declining. So we need to make sure that the values are stabilized. And then really what it comes down to is also the horizon, right? So you have to give up something to gain something in the long term, but we're all very short-term oriented, right? We want instant results. We want to see next year or year after, and our political cycle also is incentivizing us to make decisions on 2 or 4 year cycles. So the development and the kind of responsible development to reverse those intentional government policies that created those disparities and that intentional segregation, we're talking work that's going to take generations to come.
Sure.
You know, that's not going to happen. And so what I see happening in community economic development is all those pillars of economic development: your healthcare, your housing, your financing, your credit, your education. All those need to work in concert together. And we all need to decide, you know what, for the next few years, this is going to take a lot of sustained investment and effort on everyone's part and be intentional. I'm going to move into this neighborhood because I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And I may be living next to a low-income housing project that may need to be redeveloped,
Mhm,
but I'm going to do that. I'm willing to do it as long as my family is safe,
mhm.
which again goes back to the city playing a role, which it does. I'm willing to make this investment as an individual and as a business potentially, because I see that in 10 years, this neighborhood is going to be vibrant, diverse, both socioeconomically, but also will have an upward mobility built into it for those people that are selling their houses. They can walk away with a little equity versus what is happening now in parts of Columbia. You walk away with the same level of equity as you put in 20 years ago.
Wow, wow. Jennifer, you got another one for us?
Yes, I think it actually builds on what Mr. Martin was saying, but I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. One is about minority communities being locked out of investment opportunities due to income, and how do you advance past that to actively invest in communities? For the example, how do you make Eau Claire look like more like Shandon when it comes to boutiques and eateries? And there's also a question, I think that's related to that, but specifically about things like grocery stores and how there are communities that are food deserts, and if there's a way to incentivize specific types of businesses like grocery stores to come and stay in Black and brown neighborhoods.
So the first one had to do with food deserts and getting grocery stores to want to come in and stay. And the other one had to do with?
How do you actively invest in communities? And it gives the
How
example.
do you make Eau Claire look like Shandon?
Right.
So Dom, that's a you question. It's interesting because the question has to do with how do we get investments without money? And I don't know where to start with that. So Dom.
Let me make, I clearly don't have, I'm totally ill-equipped to solve all these problems, but I have a couple of ideas that I'll share with you. And in fact,
Right.
I was recently asked by another large city council to provide recommendations how to close some of these gaps in their community, particularly when it comes to communities of color, minority, African-American communities. And so, you know, basically using the Eau Claire example, Eau Claire is a market imperfection, to use sort of economic term, right? There's a market imperfection where the cost of building or redeveloping a property and locating there is higher than the ultimate value of the property in today's marketplace. So make it real simple. If you build a house in that neighborhood and it costs you $100 a foot to build a house, and then it appraises for $80 a foot when you get ready to sell it, it makes no economic sense. And the market,
to the builder,
or to whoever's buying it. So it's a market imperfection, and then market imperfection in this case was created by all the issues that we read about so sadly. Right? So the only way to do that is initially the city or the government, and I do agree that there is a role for the government to play, has to close that market imperfection. It's no different than Senator Scott's opportunity zones, right? It's the idea that you have certain areas that have not received proper investment, and we have to close that gap temporarily or for the next few years to make those properties more market oriented. So in Eau Claire, let's use an example. The city could come in and say, okay, we will essentially provide that gap in equity, and maybe even take an equity position in that property. And after 10 years, we're going to recoup it because the surrounding property values will have increased sufficiently in their value that a market-oriented developer with no subsidy or no incentive from a municipality or opportunity zone motivated investor or new market tax credit investor or other investors will be needed. So that's one of the solutions that I see implemented successfully across some communities across the country, where those cities or municipalities or government comes in and closes that market imperfection.
And you know, the question relating to getting businesses to invest in neighborhoods, and someone mentioned grocery stores, the cost of profit margin is so thin. there are all kinds of disincentives for people to bring a grocery store to a neighborhood because the profit margin is so thin. So when a store doesn't think the community can sustain the store isn't benevolent enough to say, I just want to do it for the good of the community. They're actually there to make a profit. And so it creates a really tough situation in a number of communities. I've seen folks do things like food co-ops in areas where it's tough to get a grocery store to come in and set up shop. And because it is becoming increasingly difficult to get grocery stores to come in and locate in underserved communities. It's unfortunate, but I'm seeing that as a trend. Does anybody want to jump in on that conversation with any wisdom?
No wisdom, but I have certainly, I was on city council when we worked very hard to have a Food Lion open on Taylor Street. It could not, it was in the middle of two universities and neighborhoods, and they could not make it work.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you're saying about grocery stores, the margin is thin.
Mm-hmm.
It is a hard business and it is hard to make a profit.
Mm-hmm. It is. And that's what I hear from them, you know, all the time, because, you know, it's not a new issue. And done shows on it, radio shows on it, you know, and then this was a group out of Winston-Salem that I interviewed, and they were making food co-ops work in communities, but that requires work on the part of the community.
Yes.
And responsibility on the part of the community to fill in that gap. And but they were making it work, and it seemed to be a good idea. I am concerned, though, as we look at what's happening with the pandemic right now, that these needs, this food insecurity and affordable housing and healthcare and education, social justice, all of it is going to be so much more intensified, and all of us are going to be called on to do more, to think more, to contribute more in terms of resources. But I do feel good because I do recognize that even though those problems are coming, there are a number of people who are willing to give of themselves to try to solve those problems. That's always good. Before we turn it over, yes, Dr. Scott.
Can you hear me? I was going to say that I've seen food co-ops be very successful in Michigan, in the Detroit area, in Oakland, and in Harlem. And people do get behind an effort when they see that, you know, the Whole Foods is not coming, the Lion equivalent is not coming to Harlem. You know, so I think that it is an empowering thing for a community to understand that we're going to have to make a food co-op work for us. And even in Atlanta, when I lived in Southwest Atlanta, I lived in a food desert that had been for decades like that. And people enjoyed the idea of developing a food co-op.
Yeah. Dr. Scott, I meant to ask you about this earlier. You lived all over the world and you served in places all over the world. And so your experiences are vast. What do other places do?
Food co-ops in terms of other places do. In terms of this issue, one of the things that I wanted to mention to Anne and to Dom is making sure to have the community at the center of the work. You know, I can understand them, you know, not feeling at first comfortable, but when you go to them and say, can you help me to understand what is equitable here? What works for you here? What does this look like? That really helps a lot. Just the same thing as community participatory research. Going in and saying, you know, I'm really interested in knowing this about your community, and having them say, we'll help you, but we own the data. We own the research. We own the community. And having you say, well, I'm good with that. Let's work together on that.
So guys, this is the time when everybody's going to get a closing comment, okay? I'm going to start with you, Dr. Scott, then I'm going to go to you, Dr. Bustles, and then we'll go to you, Mr. Miartin, and then we'll go to you, Councilwoman Sinclair. Oh, did I miss Dr. Epps? I'm not looking at him.
Yeah.
We'll get you in there, Dr. Epps, after Dr. Scott. Go ahead.
Okay. I find that the racial wealth gap is something that needs to be addressed for all of these areas. I agree with all of the panelists that working in concert is what we need to do through an equity lens in every area, in education, health and finance, and in health and employment. All of that needs to be worked together. I think there needs to be strategy surrounding multi-generational focus on repairing the wealth gap. I think
Thank you
that
very
will
much.
cover all of our areas.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Are you there, Dr. Epps? You're close?
Yes. I would just say in closing, there are a couple of issues that I think if we're going to be successful in remedying our past, root and branch, if we're going to be successful in remedying these, especially as it relates to education, we've got to recognize that we cannot pursue situations that are structured around equalizing resources. We've got to look at the issue, and I think Dr. Scott mentioned this, we've got to look at the issue of equity, and that is not applying equal remedies to all students or all situations, but applying the remedy that the situation requires. And there are areas that find that very difficult. I know we have got, in my estimation, we've got to tone down the politics that have entered this issue, especially as, you know, everything's political, but everything doesn't have to be driven by politics. One of the reasons I think this nation has done such a poor job with the pandemic is because it has become so political that the political decisions outweigh the health decisions.
Yes.
That same thing is true in education. Whether we're talking about the Chamber of Commerce or whomever we're talking about, we've got to recognize that students who have been adversely affected by this history need resources disproportionate to other students.
Yes.
So to look at average student cost and some of the things that are thrown out by either the media, and I want to make a comment about media too, and I'll be brief.
Okay, be brief.
But let me give you a success story, and that is I had a problem with the state newspaper, the way what I thought was biased coverage of issues involving the African-American community. And I asked for a meeting with their senior staff. Not only did they, and I didn't think the meeting would be granted, quite frankly, but not only did they grant the meeting, we gave them 5 recommendations. Brian Tolley has implemented 3 of those 5 recommendations to make for a more unbiased, a more accurate reporting by the print media. That same thing is an issue with all media. Media affects public policy. Media affects public opinion, and public opinion drives public policy. Public policy is why we are where we are with so many of these.
You're right. And the media has a tremendous impact. Dr. Epps, it's always good to see you. Thank you, sir. Mr. Miarton, you're close.
Well, thank you.
I'm going over a couple of minutes, so
I'll be-
Councilwoman Devine, am I okay? Okay, she said okay.
I'll be brief. What I really want to share is that you know, not to preach to this choir, but one of the things that the book that we all had the I was going to say great pleasure, but probably that's not an accurate description of our experience reading the book. But reading is the case for closing these gaps has not been made clearly to the public. And I do agree with Dr. Epps, we shouldn't politicize this issue, but it's going to take political will
Yes.
to intentionally invest more resources into these gaps, into closing the gaps that were created by the government. And one thing that's a recurring frustration for me, we fail to articulate how critically important to the economic viability. Forget what's right. Just for a minute, let's look at the economics. If you looked at the closing the racial wealth gap, the estimates I've seen from various groups would be that our GDP would grow by extra 2 to 3% a year, translating into trillions of dollars of wealth for everyone. And so I know we are here because we believe this is an issue that is imperative to close. In the greatest, most powerful country in the world, we cannot let these issues stand. But even if you didn't feel that strongly for the right reasons, let's come together and articulate that this is economically self-interested for all of us to solve these issues. We all would be better off if we eliminated these disparities. And if we are clear about articulating that this is not going to be a politically divisive issue, because we will make it in the self-interest of every person to recognize that if a neighborhood is left in extreme poverty and the children growing up in the neighborhood have a statistically worse chance of succeeding in life than a same child across the street, that is an issue that we cannot let stand for all the right and all the wrong reasons.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you, Dom. Thank you for the work that you do down there at Optus too. It's making a big difference in our communities. We appreciate you. Dr. Bustles, your close.
I had a different closing, but thinking about some of the political will conversations we've already had, I have found that when we use the frame of children and when we talk about the next generation and the change that we want to make, we can bring a lot of people to the table. While this book was very depressing, especially in a time, and this word is overused, unprecedented time, especially thinking about yesterday, we have to figure out ways to work together in a city that has diverse interests and oftentimes conflicting interests. And so I encourage you, if you have that spark in you like I do to want to do something about this, use the frame of children. Think about how this affects our next generation and how we can set them up to succeed. I think that you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who doesn't want to help children. And I think that the language of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, or adverse community environments, as I mentioned in the comments, are a really great way to bring up the complex factors that have led to the modern day redlining that we see today and the detrimental impacts of some of the historical policies that were created. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Aditi. I appreciate very much for all the work that you do as well. Councilwoman Sinclair, you can close for us.
Just a quick reminder to participate in the zoning hearing, to learn about the zoning law, that the zoning ordinance will not be revised again anytime soon. So now's the time to say your piece. But I do want to talk just briefly about sort of a reaction that I know Councilwoman Devine and I have had, is that we don't want to go through this process, these panel discussions and wring our hands. We want something to come from that. And so we are very open to hearing what people have learned from other communities, other cities. Let us know what has worked so that we can learn more about it and see if it works here. I think political will is important, but we also need the will of the community to make a difference. It's both.
That's a nice sentiment. Well, it's been my pleasure to speak with each of you tonight. I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer and turn it back over to Councilwoman Devine for our closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for doing an amazing job moderating, as I knew you would.
Thank you.
And thank you to our amazing panel. The wealth and depth of knowledge that you guys have helps me remain hopeful that we've got the talent right here in our community to address these challenges and to really come up with real solutions. Just a couple notes that I had. I want to thank our partners for this series, our Historic Columbia, Columbia SC 63, the University of South Carolina, and Richland Library. And thanks to the Richland Library and their partnership, our next session will be in 2 weeks, and we are bringing the author, Richard Rothstein, and he will be talking about his research, about his study, and a lot of the things. I know we were kind of picking and choosing. Last month we talked about gentrification. This month we're talking about redlining, but there's so many more things in this book. So I encourage you to join us again in 2 weeks, and look out for the registration to get on that to watch him and be part of that conversation.
Okay.
If you did miss last month's conversation on gentrification, we do have that on YouTube. And so you can go back and watch that video. And then of course, this one will be available after tonight if you want to go back and listen and watch. I know I saw in the chat, somebody may have missed Councilwoman Sinclair's talking about the book. So again, the book is called The Color of Law. Oddity, I think you have it, and a couple of you have it. If you hold it up, right there, it's called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And it is how our government segregated America. Our partner, Richland Library, has book club packets. And so you can actually check out the book in denominations of 5 or 10 to do a book club. So I encourage you to do that. And if you do want to, purchase your own copy, the author will be here in 2 weeks. And so you can let us know, we can make sure that we get the author's discount rate that he's offering us here in Columbia. I want to, again, the public hearing that Ann talked about is January 19th. There will not be a vote by City Council. I know there's a couple people asked in comment about, how can they participate? It's hard during COVID. This is an opportunity for you to learn about it, but this is not the end. And so there will be conversations. Each of your district council members will be having meetings in the districts to talk about how the zoning ordinance will affect your particular neighborhood. And then Mr. Duvall, the mayor, and I, as your at-large folks, will certainly be around to entertain your questions and comments about that as well. So I encourage you to be a part of those conversations, because someone made the comment in the question about how can, Eau Claire look like Shandon with boutiques and things. Well, this zoning ordinance will allow some of those things. Councilwoman Sinclair mentioned, there are things that can't happen. We have developers who want to put a small coffee shop, but it's not zoned for that. Well, this ordinance hopefully will allow us to have that kind of flexibility. So I want to encourage you to be a part of it. And then lastly, I just want to tell you guys, this is really, this conversation is really important. I know it can be difficult, but Dr. Bustles mentioned a mental shift, and that is really what we're trying to seek here. As a member of City Council, and I know I speak for the mayor and my colleagues, that there are so many things that we want to do and want to address. We hear the community's concerns, but they are sometimes appears to be conflicting interests and priorities, but we're all one city. It's not conflicting if we all come through it with through a different lens, and we have a mental shift to understand that what we've always done isn't the way we need to be doing things. And so you might need to address things in a different way. We do want to address things from an equitable lens. And I want to share that I have this graphic that I love to use, and it helps me with the mental shift. It is a picture, and it shows some folks trying to watch a baseball game on the other side of a fence. And there's 3 different ones. The first one, they all are standing on the same playing field, trying to look over this fence, but somebody's in a wheelchair, somebody is shorter than the other, and someone's taller, so they can't all see. The second one, they're on different levels so that they all can see the same thing. The third one, the fence gets to be is taken down. That's what we want to do. We want to remove the barriers to the racial wealth gap. We want to remove the barriers to inequities in the city of Columbia. And in order for us to remove those barriers, we got to look at things differently. And so we want everybody to come to the table with solutions and with the spirit of how do we work together to make sure that we are truly one Columbia, as the mayor says. And so Councilwoman Sinclair and Robin Waits have agreed graciously, thank you so much, ladies, to help take community comments. So those of you who had comments in the chat that we didn't get to, or you had questions, Jennifer and Chandler are going to help me make sure that we get all those, and we'll get you your answers to those questions if we didn't get to your question. But if you have a comment or a suggestion, we're going to make sure that Ann and Robin have those. And then our fourth session, next session will be the author. And our fourth session on February 4th will be hosted by Mayor Benjamin, and he will have some of his other mayors from around the country, because as Dr. Scott and Dr. Bustle said, there are other cities who are doing things, and they're doing some amazing things that are addressing these tough issues. And we want to be able to be the leader here in South Carolina, our capital city, and come up with these innovative ideas as well. And so we want you to be part of that session. But after that February 4th session, Ann, Robin, and I are going to bring forward some real solutions that you guys help us come up with and make those presentations to City Council. So with that said, I just want to, again, thank you all again for participating. Encourage those who could not be here to go back and watch the replay and be part of the conversation, and know that the mayor, myself, and the other members of Columbia City Council, we remain prepared to address these issues courageously, collectively, but for the most part, but most of all, making sure that we're addressing them completely so that we can really move forward as a city. So with that said, good night. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, and we'll see you back here on January 21st for the session with Richard Rothstein.
Looking forward to it. Good night.